Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Eileen Galuli, and as the Executive Director of the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel entitled Orientalism, Literature, and Intellectuals. Two of our speakers are Edward Said Fellows, who have been awarded research grants. That means they've been awarded research grants to explore the Said Archive, which is held at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library here at Columbia. But all three are early career scholars who are producing scholarship that we might describe as Saidian. That is, scholarship that crosses disciplinary boundaries in pursuing humanistic inquiry that promotes intercultural understanding. Said believed that it was the critic's responsibility not only to reveal the complicit links between culture and power, but also to develop alternative modes of analysis to resist injustice. I'm going to introduce the presenters in the order in which they'll be speaking. Okay. First is Julia Hartley. Julia is a lecturer in comparative literature at the University of Glasgow. Prior to joining Glasgow in 2023, she was lecturer in comparative literature at King's College London, a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Warwick, a Laming Fellow at Queen's College, Oxford, and an Edward W. Said Fellow at Columbia University. She's the author of Reading Dante and Proust by Analogy, which was published in 2019, and peer-reviewed articles in Iranian Studies and 19th century French Studies. Her most recent book, from which her talk today draws, is Iran and French Orientalism, Persia and the Literary Culture of 19th Century France. Second speaker is Marieke Mueller. She's a lecturer in French culture and translation at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. Previous teaching appointments include King's College London and the University of Oxford, where she also received her PhD, and she wrote on Sartre's biography of Flaubert. Mueller works on the intersection of theory and literature, especially existentialism and sociology, and on women's writing and gender. She's published on approaches to reading, on Sartre's understanding of institutional violence, and on contemporary literature, including Edouard Louis and Didier Eribon. She is currently working on a project examining the relationship between narrative and violence, for which she's received seed funding from the British Academy. And finally, there'll be Rob Jackson, who's a senior lecturer in political thought at Manchester Metropolitan University. And he's currently an Edward W. Said Fellow here at the SOF Heyman. He's co-editor of Revisiting Gramsci's Notebooks, and his forthcoming articles on Said and Gramsci in Interventions and Notebooks. He co-created the Critical Theory in Hard Times Network, which is based in the UK, and which organized recent workshops on decolonializing critical thought and racial capitalism and anti-racist futures. He's published in Topoi, Theory and Event, Thesis 11, and the International Gramsci Journal, Gramsciana, as well as collections on subjectivity and the political and the meanings of violence, published by Routledge. He also co-organized the Past and Present International Gramsci Conference at King's College London in 2015. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Just stop my timer. Hi, thank you to everyone physically in the room for coming on this sad, rainy day. Lovely to see you. Hello to the Zoom audience, whom I can't see. So I'm really happy to be back here at the Heyman Center for the Humanities, where I spent a month as an Edward Said visiting fellow in 2018. And at that time, I was very much at the early stages, the beginning of a project with this book. I'm going to pass it in case you want to pass it around. Always fun to have a show and tell moment. So today what I'm going to do is sort of really introduce you to how I started articulating the project, thinking about what I was doing in relation to Edward Said's Orientalism, which is, of course, a text published a while ago, and yet such a cornerstone for how we think about Western representations of the Middle East today. And I remember standing here in front of you, being at the book launch of Wael Halak's Restating Orientalism here in this room in 2018. And I was relieved to see that one could disagree with aspects of Orientalism. So hopefully this is safe to do today as well. So the sort of starting premise for my book was really narrowing down this very broad idea of Orientalism, of the Orient in general, to something more specific. So I sort of phrased the starting question as, what if instead of viewing Orientalism as a one-size-fits-all category, we consider the treatment of a specific Oriental language and culture at a particular time and in a particular place? So in my case, that was Iran in 19th century France, thinking about that particular context. On the slide, you have an image, for example, of the inauguration of the Susa rooms of the Louvre Museum in the late 19th century. So obviously, someone having been exposed to these artworks would have a very different understanding of the Achaemenid Empire than someone from the early 19th century or before. And then I was very interested in thinking about French writers' sources. Instead of thinking in terms of a creation or invention of the Orient in the West, I wanted to reflect on how Europeans interact with cultural artifacts, with literature from the Middle East, in my case, from Iran. And so the types of sources that French writers were responding to were classical Persian literature, which became available in French translation in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, you could only really read Sa'di's Golestan. And then suddenly you had, Ferdowsi, Hafez, Khayyam, all the big Persian poets available in the French language. There were a lot of New World histories and new studies of religion. So at this time, French people learn about Zoroastrianism and about the ancient Persians, not just as enemies of the Greeks, but as a self-standing culture. The artifacts in the Louvre that you see on the slide. And then also I look at a lot of travelogues and think about these first-hand experiences of Iran. And this reflection on sources brought me to reflect on what has been one of the critiques of Edward Said's Orientalism, articulated very early on by James Clifford in his review of the book, where he notes that in Orientalism, Said does not make more than a passing reference to, quote, the brute reality of the cultures and nations whose location is in the East. And thus, Orientalist inauthenticity is not answered by any authenticity. And so I was really interested in how, by looking at the sources used by French writers, I could reflect on how they formed their understanding of Iranian culture, but also how they instrumentalized these sources to create certain narratives. So, of course, there's a mediation, there's a response, there's narrative building, but the starting point is always an Iranian cultural artifact, and then I'm interested in looking at how this is then transformed. So to give you one example, because it's always helpful to have examples, here you have a frontispiece of Judith Gautier's novel, Iskandar, Histoire Persane. And this novel is a rewriting of the two chapters in Ferdowsi's Shahnameh about Alexander the Great, who is known as Iskandar in Persian. And what Gautier does is she's basically interested in how, in the Persian tradition, Alexander the Great, instead of being this representative of Western superiority, he is actually adopted as an Iranian figure. So in Iranian myth-making, Alexander is the secret love child of the king of Iran and the daughter of Philip of Macedon. And so he is mixed race, and he is also the rightful heir to the throne. And so Gautier is rewriting the Shahnameh in terms of style, theme, plot, but really homing in on these notions of cultural fluidity, which are very different to, say, our narratives of, Orientalism as self-other, these oppositional models. I think a text such as this really cannot be accounted for through that paradigm. And this sort of brings me to kind of say my beef with some of Orientalism. And it's this sense, quoted here, in a sense, the limitations of Orientalism are the limitations that follow upon disregarding, essentializing, denuding the humanity of another culture, people, or geographical region. And what I found through doing this project is, of course, we have racist tropes, Orientalist tropes in the sense, illustrated by Said in some cases, but actually in the majority of the works of literature that I studied, there's much more interest in sort of familiarizing Iran, in sort of seeing what are the commonalities between Persian culture and French culture. So it's not actually presented in these extremely dehumanizing terms. And I've got sort of 3 quotations here to give you a feel for that. So the first is from the preface of a historical novel about Queen Parysatis, who was an ancient Persian queen. And the author was an archaeologist. And in the preface, Jane Dieulafoy explains how the inspiration for the novel came while on the site of the ancient city of Susa. I identified my life with that of the great of the earth. So Dieulafoy is talking about how being in the geographic location, thinking about the material culture, helps them sort of imagine what it was like to live in ancient Iran. And then the whole novel really centers on the perspective of this Persian queen, who is not there just as an exotic other, but really very psychologically developed character. And we sort of enter the space of ancient Persia. The second example is from a rather odd collection of poems. So they are imaginary quatrains by the theologian Al-Ghazali, who did not write poetry, but this poet imagines, what if I explore his ideas through the medium of poetry? And in the preface, the poet writes, under the pseudonym Jean Lahore, his actual name was Henri Cazalis, Al-Ghazali surprised me. I found there a part of my own thinking. His life, once I came to know it, resembled mine. So again, this big emphasis on commonality. And then finally, the third quote is from Marc Bibesco's travelogue, The 8 Paradises, which I remember was one of the texts I was actually thinking about when I was here as a Said Fellow. And Bibesco is describing the Shia mourning rituals around the month of Muharram. And rather than say, oh, this sort of barbaric or other, she reflects on how different religions and cultures have rituals around mourning. And so she writes, and what does it matter if the adorable victim had his side torn by the tusk of a boar, the scimitar of a caliph, or the lance of a centurion? So this mourning for Hassan and Ali, according to her, is just one example of mourning as this important emotional part of many different religions and cultures. And it's very sort of universalist, this sort of emphasis on different examples of a similar ritual. And so to account for examples such as this, I really found myself thinking of how we need to go beyond that paradigm of difference. In the picture here, by the way, that's Marc Bibesco, the travel writer I was just quoting, being shown tourist goods while on a trip to Iran. So with that original articulation of Orientalism from Said, which was my starting point, we have this focus on a hierarchical opposition, right? One part of humanity, the West, is elevated over the other part, the Middle East or Orient, and we have all these binary oppositions that we're all very familiar with now that structure this opposition. But through the examples I looked at, I found that while difference is one of the ways in which French people were articulating their relationship to Iran in the 19th century, identification and familiarization were also very important. And you often have this act of cultural comparison, of articulating similarities as a starting point for understanding this other culture. And so you have this, what I call this negotiation between what makes Iran familiar and what makes it foreign. And so French writing on Iran is very much full of ambivalences, nuances, and even contradictions. Writers can change their mind. So if we go back to Bibesco here, for example, when she first arrives in Iran, she's very shocked by the veil. She finds it strange. But then midway through her travelogue, she basically acknowledges her bias. She says, as a European, at first I thought this, but now I've been here longer. I understand local cultural practices, and I sort of realized that I was unduly critical. So there's this possibility of shifting opinions as well. And so I found myself complementing that initial model of Orientalism that we have in Said with two other studies of cross-cultural encounters that have sort of much more, let's say, non-oppositional, non-binary approaches. So the first there is Anil Bhatti and Dorothée Kimmig's book Similarity, a paradigm for culture theory, in which they start reflecting on how most interactions between cultures involve a reflection on similarity. And by similarity, they emphasize we don't mean different cultures being identical. We mean this negotiation between what makes us similar, what are the things we have in common, but what are the limits of that? So it's this acknowledgement of commonality and difference as part of what is being negotiated. And then going back to a much older text, but one I still found very valuable, Todorov's Nous les Autres, which in the English translation is called On Human Diversity. And what I found really sort of inspiring about Todorov is that he's equally critical of universalism and cultural relativism. So he explains sort of a very basic approach to universalism has been instrumentalized by Western imperialism, has been sort of a justification for imposing one's own culture abroad. So therein lies the limit of universalism. But at the same time, he talks about how cultural relativism can equally be problematic, because if you start saying, well, you know, democracy is a Western value, feminism is a Western value, and other cultures, you know, can do things differently, then you're dehumanizing and not treating other people as deserving of the same human rights. So I really appreciated that kind of balancing act that he does between the two extremes. And I found myself finding that a lot of the writers I was looking at are actually doing that. They're constantly balancing between emphasizing that universal take, but also acknowledging cultural specificities. And then we've got Todorov segue. Another key thing I found myself thinking about through this project was the politics of genre. So in this sort of very early essay, The Origin of Genres, Todorov wrote, "It is because genres exist as institutions that they function as horizons of expectation for readers and as models of writing for authors." So I became interested in how the way a text represents another culture is hugely shaped by the genre the author is writing in, both in terms of the norms and constraints of that form of writing, but also in terms of how the public will react to the text. And it's an idea that I actually find is implicit in Orientalism, especially when Said wrote about strategic location and strategic formation, but it's not sort of fully expanded on, addressed explicitly. And that became something I was really interested in developing through this project. So I chose to work across several different genres. We have in the book poems, novels, histories, travel writing, and various kinds of performing arts. So the image on the slide here are the costume designs for a ballet, for example. And so I found it was really interesting that through looking at these different genres, I could sort of take my initial question of, you know, how was Iran specifically seen in the French 19th century, and kind of narrow it down to how was Iran written? How did different types of writing shape different visions of Iran? So to give you an example, the treatment of the Achaemenid Empire is very different in Gobineau's infamous racialist essay, the essay on the inequality of the human races, and in Dieu la foi Sparizatis, the novel I just mentioned. So for Dieu la foi, the ancient Persians are there as characters, these fully fledged individuals with their own psychology, their own family relations. Gobineau is just interested in writing a grand narrative about how all of civilization is determined by race. And so the Achaemenid Persians represent the Aryan race, but then the fall of the Achaemenid Empire is because they mixed their blood. So one same subject matter will be entirely different based on whether you're going through a historical novel or those kind of broad brushstrokes, general world histories. And similarly, the way the Shahnameh is used in Iskandar, the novel I mentioned earlier, will be very different to something like the ballet that you have the costume for on the slide, because of course literature and performing arts function so differently. And then what I found was there was another layer to the politics of genre. So genre is political in terms of how is Iran represented, how is the kind of writing shaping that representation, but also what genres are available to which authors. And I found myself becoming really interested in the women authors in the book. Women would not have had the same level of academic authority as men. They could not have written these portentous essays. And so you have sort of short poems, fiction, journalism, travel writing. Women are exploring these other genres. But I found overall that these treatments of Iran tended to be much more nuanced and also experimental. So for instance, Marceline de Bord-de-Valmore has a poem called Les Roses de Saadi, which is a rewriting of a metaphor from Saadi, but she chooses not to exoticize and not to highlight its Persian origins, whereas the male poets at the time, like Victor Hugo and others, were very interested in exoticism. I mentioned Gautier's novel, which rewrites the Shahnameh. Anna de Noailles is another woman poet who sort of plays with the cliches of Orientalist poetry and undermines them. Bibesco, the travel writer I just told you about, who has a sort of very nuanced take on cultural difference and whose opinion evolves. And Dulafoy, who wrote historical novels, but also a lot of travel writing on Iran. These were really the very rewarding, exciting texts to look at. And so finally, without going through in detail, this is sort of the architecture of the book, what it ended up looking like. So I have sort of that opening, the introduction, where I sort of reflect on the things I just raised in terms of how I relate to Said, what other types of materials I wanted to look at. And then the book has chapters on poetry, on history and historical fiction, on travel writing, and finally, the performing arts. So I'll end here by really saying thank you for allowing me to spend time here as an Edward Said Fellow when I was right at the beginning of this project. And it's a delight to come back and sort of share the final result with you. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to give a talk today. And apologies for not being a Said or Orientalism researcher. I wish I was. So what I'm trying to do, what I've tried to do with this talk is to relate to the theme of intellectuals and their responsibility in the face of injustice and structural violence. So, and more specifically, so my work is on contemporary French authors. And it's become almost commonplace to say that the political has made a return in contemporary literature in France. And indeed, the recent edited volume by Alexandre Geffen from 2022, called Literature as a Political Affair, contains interviews with 26 authors, some of which are known as political authors writing the social, such as Annie Ernaux or others like Louis Delorme, are more associated usually with experimental writing. And so that's just to say, and so they're quite surprising additions, and that just to show how diverse now the political contribution or the relationship between politics and literature in France is, and how important the political has become. And that ranges from participation in government, in the case of Leila Slimani, who represents Macron within the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, to others like Marie-Hélène Lafont, who have a more mediated reflection on society, such as in her work on rural France. So among this panoply of political authors or authors relating to the political, I'd like to focus today on Édouard Louis, who you might have heard about because he's become a bit of an international superstar now, a very young writer with a corpus of autobiographical novels that trace his experience of homophobia in working class or post-industrial communities in northern France, the social violence that shapes the lives of members of these communities, and his own journey of social mobility that granted him access to the French political and cultural elites via his education at the prestigious École Normale Supérieure. So the media discourse on Louis focuses almost solely on the theme of social mobility. So he's a bit of a Rastignac of the contemporary world, to the point where he's compared to Macron in their trajectory from coming from the north of France to Paris. So this is very, very dominant in the media. And it is true that his own recourse to a Bourdieusian framework, his auto-sociographic fiction, makes him one of the many representatives of the movement of the transclasse writers, so writers having transcended class boundaries, as theorized by the philosopher Chantal Jacquet. The critical literature dedicated to Louis reflects the diversity of themes in his work, which includes commentary on the intersection of class and sexuality, questioning of binary gender identity, his work on shame, the media's tendency to read classism into his work, and Louis' own very careful construction of his public persona through interviews, talk shows, and his social media profiles, mainly Instagram. So my wider work examines violence in the work of Edouard Louis and a number of other authors in contemporary French literature. And today, as I said, I would like to contribute to the theme of intellectuals by tracing his understanding of the relationship between literature and the political, and bring this into conversation with perhaps a surprising interlocutor, namely Jean-Paul Sartre, to whom Louis does refer numerous times, and who's probably the prototype of the committed intellectual from the post-war era. So what I'll do three things. I'll highlight both Sartre's and Louis' skepticism towards facile assumptions about political writing and the supposedly transformative role of literature. And instead, I think both Louis' confrontative, I'll explain what he means by that in a second, confrontative and Sartre's free literature involve first and foremost a questioning of the author's own position within the literary field. And I'll then conclude by looking at the concrete workings of political writing. And I would like to suggest that textual practice forms a continuum with political positioning and public intervention for both. To start, I think for both Louis and for Sartre, literature is an urgent matter. For both, literature takes place in a situation of political urgency and is measured by its response to this. In an interview with Libération, Louis called his life as a writer shameful, adding that rather than writing I could demonstrate, help migrants, or came for LGBT rights. I could do things that have an immediate effect on someone's life. And so the benchmark is high in that sense. And Louis' texts are permeated by what he calls the violence of the world. And having left behind the bleak world of his childhood, his books are tasked with the function of being, quote, weapons for others. And the urgency that Sartre, on the other hand, attributes to the role of literature is couched in similarly bellicose language or imagery, as What is Literature from 1947 declares that literature throws you into the battle and words are like pistols. Sartre's thinking, at the same time, is profoundly marked by the war, by fascism, and he writes extensively about racism, especially anti-Semitism, and about colonialism at the time. So for him, too, literary authors are measured by their relationship with these violent situations, and their task is to, quote, make sure that no one is ignorant of the world and able to declare themselves innocent. So first question is, who then do these people write for? What does this mean? Who is the political agent tasked with carrying out change? Who is the interlocutor with literature? And the answer is shortly, it's not so easy. So Louis rejects decidedly any naive conception of literature as straightforwardly unifying or as a vector of empowerment for disenfranchised parts of society. And this is not so much to do with a supposedly classist attitude that is often attributed to him, although he does avoid idealizing the post-industrial working class that he came from. But his caution is first and foremost predicated on a Bourdieusian view of culture, including literature, as inherently exclusive, reinforcing the distinction of those who already possess cultural capital. So Louis is therefore skeptical of strategies that aim at superficially democratizing access to education and culture, whilst simply imposing on those excluded from culture the very codes of cultural appreciation that are the markers of their exclusion in the first place. So in its categorical nature, I think this is doesn't always work in reality, but this is the reason why political literature becomes complicated. So in other words, Louise often asked, well, do the people that you seem to be representing in your text actually read you? And this is the answer, no, and it's not really the aim necessarily. So to turn to Sartre, while in What is Literature, he seems to be more open of a notion of the working class as a privileged interlocutor for committed writers, the text seems to agree with what Louise is saying, namely that literature can only achieve real communication in the utopian scenario of a really egalitarian society. And his theorization provides a possible starting point for thinking through the relationship between writers and society. So according to Sartre, authors are forced to reflect on their mission productively in periods when, in addition to their real public, a virtual public appears on the horizon. So when the writer perceives beyond their elite public an amorphous mass of readers which they can choose to attempt to win over or not. And so Sartre then writes a long-winded history of literature that applies exactly this. So in the 18th century, for example, writers perceive the newly emerging bourgeoisie as a possible new interlocutor, and that really is productive for the way in which they write. And his often very skeptical attitude towards the 19th century and to the second half of the 19th century in particular is exactly to do with the absence of such a virtual public for these writers. Although I should say that he disagrees with himself later, but in any case. So I think that this distinction between real and virtual public adds some nuance to what Louis' warning of a naive view of the social change that literature can effect. So for Sartre, a critical examination of the position of writers within the literary field is at the center of what he called committed literature. In Louis' case, it is striking how much his attention is directed at examining and interpreting the evolution of his own position within the literary field. In Change of Method, he traces his own relationship with literature. Initially, he explains, reading and writing were pure vehicles of upward social mobility for him. So he read because he wanted to get out, go to university, and then later morphed into genuinely fulfilling activities. Moreover, books in his work over and over again appear as material objects. So in History of Violence, which recounts the experience of sexual violence, the narrator holds the book while walking the streets of Paris at the beginning of the text, and in concert with the growing violence of the events narrated, the book is replaced later with a cutter knife in the narrator's hand as he walks the streets of Paris again. So by sketching his own ways of relating to literature, he breaks taboos, saying, I only read because I wanted to get out, and subverts the dominant reverence of literature that he criticizes. As well as his relationship with literature, Louis' text also problematizes his position as author. So he recounts his relationship with the publishing establishment and reflects on his altered lifestyle once he'd become a published author. So he could be said to be practicing what his friend and collaborator Geoffroy de la Gannerie stipulates in his text L'Art Impossible, namely that literature should thematize itself, set out the reasons for its existence and the modes of consumption that it demands. So both Sartre's and Louis' examination of authorial positioning goes hand in hand with a sharp criticism of the literary establishment that surrounds them. Sartre, in What is Literature, chastises a conception of literary art as procedures that only serve to make texts inoffensive. He calls them chemically treated, and he attacks professional critics who please themselves when entering libraries as one enters cemeteries. He denounces the dominant understanding of style as something that allows precisely the domestication of previously subversive texts. Again, it should be said that he questions this later, but anyway. So Geoffroy de la Gannerie, again, in a text described as the result of a dialogue with Louis, so it's pretty close to what Louis is doing, agrees with Sartre that pure style is impossible and that 19th century aestheticism, instead of breaking with the real, merely denegates it. Much more than Sartre, Louis conceives of his project as inherently anti-literary, as he writes in a text about his mother, A Woman's Battles and Transformations, because now I know they built what they call, or they constructed what they call literature against lives and bodies such as hers. Because I know from now on that writing about her and writing about her life means writing against literature. So what then should a writer do if they are writing against the literary establishment? For Sartre, the answer is unsurprisingly inscribed in his phonological ontology. So writers need to act on the world, and they do so by revealing it. To name is to show, to name and to show is already to alter human reality. Second, then, for the reader of this act of revealing, this has to go via an imaginary engagement with the events recounted in the text. So the text needs to appeal to the reader's freedom and invite them to recreate the textual world and thereby develop a sense of responsibility for it. And this is fairly close, I think, to what Louis does when he talks about literature having to provide a space for the violence of the world and to make possible the experience of this. And so Louis explicitly refers to Sartre's emphasis on literature's task of revealing reality and revealing the world in a conversation with the filmmaker Ken Loach, when he explains that, quote, Sartre wrote extensively about the question of rendering visible, but whereas today new media, but today new media have made practically everything visible. The question is therefore no longer to show or about showing, but how to show, but how to confront. I think this is an important shift. What would be an aesthetic of confrontation? So there is the shift that Louis identifies himself as operating from revealing the world to we all know what is going on now. So how can we make sure readers, anyone, doesn't ignore it? That's the argument, basically, in Louis. For him, then, this becomes, or the task becomes, a literature of confrontation. And for him, he notes some examples. He thinks that all those who have, he says, attacked literature, such as Toni Morrison and Zola, by radically transforming the way in which it operates, are examples of this. So I'll finish by asking, does Louis then overturn and radically question all literary conventions? I would say a little bit. So in A Woman's Battles and Transformations, he outlines his own approach, so how he wants to practice confrontative, a literature of confrontation. And this is what he says. I was told literature should never attempt to explanations, and I write to explain. And then he repeats this formula again. The canonical idea is that literature should not be repetition, but I like to repeat things. It should never display emotion, but I like to work with emotion. And it should never be a manifesto, but I write text as manifestos. So confrontative writing means subverting the rules of received literary taste. And his writing is indeed particularly effective when the form of writing is adapted to each text. So Who Killed My Father, for example, comes closest to the manifesto form when it names the policies of high-profile figures, including President Macron, and identifies them as having contributed to the ill health and death of large sections of the population. And then, to give you one other example, in Combat and Transformations of a Woman, the text about his mother, Louis strategically utilizes repetition, and I think repetition is one of the most interesting things about him, when brief passages from the main text then appear again as isolated, very short paragraphs on a double page, such as this, for example. So this is in the main text, and he takes it out and puts it on a page on its own. She saw the surprise in my eyes and said to me, "You see, I'm no longer the same. I am a real Parisian woman now." I smiled, "Yes, that's true. You are the Queen of Paris." So his mother has, at that point, also left the north of France, has moved to Paris, and has escaped the violence of the father of the family home. So he sees the same change in her as well. And so the repetitiveness of the text draws attention to the transformative power of repetition, as it is through imitating gestures and repeating stock phrases from others that Louis' mother's emancipation takes place. So she hears someone say something, and then she says, "Oh, I feel like I'm Simone de Beauvoir now, and I'm going to say this as well." And so her transformation is really through imitation. And so Louis seems to depart from a Bourdieusian framework here that stresses the sameness of reproduction by also envisaging the transformative power of repetition. And so just to conclude in a couple of sentences, what does this tell us about intellectuals today then? One, I think, is that there are interesting lineages within French approaches to what an intellectual is, and there's a continuing legacy of the post-war heyday of the responsibility of the author that still resonates today. But I think because writers such as Louis are such international superstars translated into English and many other languages, they also ask questions that really resonate across boundaries. And so I think they speak to very urgent questions that are asked again and again today. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to.
Do I have to press the button? It's green, so great. Excellent, thank you very much. Does that sound okay? I'd like to start by thanking Eileen and Sylvia, Sylvia and Lindsay for all they've done for organising my visit. I suppose I'm the other end of the telescope from Julie, in the sense that I'm just starting my project here as a side fellow, and I've been in the archive for a few days. I've started interviewing people and met some fantastic people at the book launch here last night. So I really appreciate everything everyone's done inviting me. And I suppose I'm here to present my sort of pre-archival project, working on the thought of Edward Said and Gramsci. My project while I'm here is on Said and Gramsci in counterpoint. And so looking, I suppose, self-evidently on the one hand at the influence of Antonio Gramsci on the thought of Edward Said, which is often remarked upon and fairly well known, but I think perhaps what I'm discovering is there is probably a depth of sort of subterranean connections that maybe are still there to be explored and brought out. But also the other side of that, which is my hypothesis, I suppose, which is that I think particularly in the newer readings of Antonio Gramsci in the last 10, 20 years, there's been a new season of Gramsci studies, which I think has been very much shaped and influenced by Edward Said's thinking and others around him, and has shaped the new attention that's been placed on themes like translation and translatability and how important those are to Gramsci's thinking. And I think in many different respects, there are new ways to turn these thinkers when you put them in dialogue and discussion with each other. So my presentation today is to try and introduce a little bit the work I've already done along the theme of the intellectuals on that front. This, I think, is partly relevant and timely because it's actually almost exactly 30 years since Edward Said delivered his BBC Reith lectures in 1993. I think it was the summer of 93 or 4, which were then gathered in the book The Representations of the Intellectual, which is here. In these lectures, Said, as he summarizes himself, stressed re-examined the role of intellectuals in modern society. And he looked at the way in which there were recurrent temptations faced by intellectuals to both accept a sort of insider's position, as he put it, as a supplicant to authority, and also tempted by the idea of the sort of security that could be provided by playing that position, and that really, if they wanted to be critical intellectuals, they had to sort of eschew those comforts and play the role, as he put it, as an exilic critic of power. Now, I think these lectures are very interesting from a variety of perspectives. In particular, Said has a very detailed discussion of the idea of the intellectual as expert, with a kind of concomitant attitude of professionalism, the unpolitical assertion of objectivity and the tendency towards careerism, and what he saw as the kind of quasi-scientific compartmentalization of disciplines. So Said really, in these lectures, is kind of demonstrating quite persuasively how this sort of specialization restricts independence of thought and how it kind of limits the moral awareness of civic responsibility of the intellectual. Now, some of the recent literature on these lectures, particularly by Rafe Drake, has pointed out how they in fact kind of are a sort of double negation, if you like, of two positions. On the one hand, this idea of the professional expert, which I've just been talking about, but also a negation of the idea of the intellectual simply as a kind of political ideologue. And there's a kind of tension being held, moving between these two positions and the different ways in which they kind of represent dangers for the exilic or critical intellectual. Now, to a certain extent, I suppose, if we think about what's happened in the last 30 years with the pressures on intellectuals towards accommodation, the rewards of advancement and recognition within university structures as they become kind of fused with sort of neoliberalization processes, the tendencies that Said identified in a way have only become more pervasive, and that might lead us to a rather kind of pessimistic sense of the sort of decline of the intellectual vocation in the 21st century, whether within the academy or beyond it. But I think there is a kind of kernel of optimism in Said's lectures on the intellectual, which is partly to do with his kind of formulation of what it means to be an intellectual, where he draws on the ideas of Jean-Paul Sartre, discussing the idea that an intellectual is never more of an intellectual than when they're surrounded, cajoled, hemmed in, hectored by society, as Said says, to be one thing or another, because only then and on that basis can intellectual work be constructed. So to a certain extent, this kind of embattled position of the intellectual is the sort of is the milieu in which the intellectual can perhaps thrive. So there's a defiance in the face of that seemingly pessimistic outlook, I think, written through Said's lectures and maybe can talk to us still today. So against this idea of professionalism that I started with, Said counterposes this with the idea of amateurism, understood, as he puts it, as an activity that is fueled by care and affection rather than by profit and selfish narrow specialization. So transgressing that kind of compartmentalization of disciplines, of treating intellectual work not simply as a career or the day job, but actually something which people are kind of passionately committed to. And there is also, of course, in the name, the exilic intellectual, the idea that thinking like an exile is integral to this project. For Said, as is well known, the nomadic intellectual, both actually and metaphorically, is a kind of boundary crosser, someone that's restless and unsettled and unsettling, and able to generate from this kind of boundary crossing position a double perspective, which enables new insights from a hybrid standpoint. And I suppose the boundary crossing back and forwards between Said and Gramsci is part of how I hope to kind of follow in the spirit of that, in terms of seeing what kind of sparks and resonances and dissonances can be generated by reading their thought against each other today. The structure of those lectures is also fascinating in a way that was illuminated to me reading Hamid Dabashi's remembrances on Said that were published last year or the year before, I think, where he points out the structure of these lectures. There's 5 or 6 of them, circling around the central lecture on the exilic intellectual of various of the talks that he gives on respectively nations and traditions, professions, power and institutions, and what he calls gods and prophets. And that all of these are what Dabashi calls compelling centers of fatal attractions. So the various pitfalls there are for the intellectual, if you like, of various types that Said explores in those lectures through, really wonderful kind of, much like he does in cultural imperialism, analyses of various texts to show how the kind of full narrative realization of the intellectual in various works like Turgenev and Proust and Flaubert helps to understand the way in which the intellectual is this kind of particularly the exilic intellectual is this kind of disruptive figure within modernity. So I could probably talk at length about those, but I'm going to pass over and maybe leave you to explore those in Said or Debashi, who articulate them better than I could. I suppose I wanted to quote, however, Said's definition of the intellectual's vocation, as he calls it, as an energy, a stubborn force engaging as a committed and recognizable voice in language and in society, with a whole slew of issues, all of them having to do, in the end, with a combination of enlightenment and emancipation or freedom. And I think this kind of conception, as Debashi has testified to himself, is kind of one that stirred a whole cohort of thinkers concerned with post-colonial formations, the role of intellectuals within them. So there is this, I think, conception that, as I say, still speaks 30 years after the lectures to, even more so perhaps, to us today. How long do I have? Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of substance of what it might mean to think, read these two figures contrapuntally against each other today. As I've said, I don't think it's anything particularly controversial to say that Said is very much influenced by Gramsci's concepts and his ideas. They feature in the contrapuntal approach itself, which reads the cultural archive as sort of polyphony of intertwined and overlapping histories. But even going back earlier to Orientalism and also, in fact, before that, there is, of course, also the idea that sort of structures even that earlier text, as Said says, of the idea of making a critical inventory or an inventory of oneself, which Said talks about, this passage from Gramsci's prison notebooks, as being kind of one of the fundamental ideas for Orientalism, as he puts it, as an attempt to inventory the traces upon me, the Oriental subject of the culture whose domination has been so powerful a factor in the life of all Orientals. So, as I say, there are both the explicit, acknowledged influences on Said's thinking, but I think there are also many kind of themes that are not necessarily either explicitly labeled as such, or also ones which operate in a more kind of subterranean level. I think one of the ways, and I suppose, given that I don't have a huge amount of time, I also want to talk about the kind of the other side of the coin, which is the way in which Said's work has kind of shaped or helps us to think maybe in a richer way about Gramsci's thinking about intellectuals. In particular, within the representations of the intellectual, there is a kind of dramatic staging that takes place, where Said takes the idea of the intellectual from Gramsci and puts it alongside and reads it in tension with the ideas of Julien Benda. In particular, Benda's 1927 critique of intellectuals that Benda thought had abandoned their calling and compromised their principles. This is in the aftermath of the Dreyfus affair. For Benda, real intellectuals are, as he put it, all those who seek their joy in the practice of an art or a science or metaphysical speculation, in short, the possession of non-material advantages. So, according to Said, despite certain limitations, and there are obviously great differences between Said and Bender, who's a kind of conservative essayist, as conventionally read. There is a kind of attractive and compelling sense, Said says, of the risks encountered and the courage required by real intellectuals. And I think in particular, it's this kind of Said's reading of Bender that helps him to articulate this idea of the intellectual as a disruptive force. And while he's kind of counterposing that to, I suppose, the way in which Gramsci is often seen as someone for whom the intellectual is someone who articulates worldviews or ideologies or arguments on behalf of a group, I think there is a kind of, I think that sort of functional understanding of the intellectual in Gramsci is perhaps also a slightly impoverished kind of version of Gramsci's thought, which inevitably arises, I suppose, when a thinker becomes kind of a syllabus, kind of one lecture introduction who's taught over and over again and gradually kind of honed into a kind of into a soundbite. Whereas I think, as I say, going back to Gramsci's writings, reading through and with Said, we see a much more interesting idea of the kind of critical aspect of the Gramscian intellectual, who is also someone who has this kind of disruptive force, this unsettling tendency to ask awkward questions, etc. That is kind of such a hallmark of the Saidian exilic intellectual. Now, of course, I don't want to try and suggest that these two figures that I'm reading can simply be merged together into one amorphous figure. I think there are obviously all sorts of differences and tensions between their thought and the idea of the kind of isolated intellectual, the individual intellectual, which is kind of one of the ways in which Said is concerned about thinking, and the kind of more always interconnected kind of individual in a group kind of conception that you find in Gramsci. But I think they both confront certain ideas about the relationship of intellectuals to the conditions of privilege, to questions of representation understood not as a sort of epiphenomena, but as something that is part of the world, representation as a part of reality and not a kind of not an external reflection of it. And I think all of these aspects really mean that, particularly the kind of new readings of newer kind of more historical philological readings of Gramsci in the last 10 or 20 years have a lot to say to kind of and I think my hypothesis is that have learned a lot and in many ways are a product of the kind of the new attitude of thinking that Said did so much to contribute to generating towards the end of the 20th century. I suppose I have another hypothesis that I'm testing. Maybe I will. Sorry, I kind of got left behind in my slides. A hypothesis that I'm testing in terms of one of the ways in which Gramsci takes concepts from different, in a sort of Saidian sense, from different domains and transgresses across boundaries and uses them in others. In particular, one of the things that I've been doing in one of the papers that Eileen kindly mentioned in the introduction that's coming out in Notebooks Journal is thinking about the way in which a term that initially seems very distant from the theme that I've been discussing, the intellectuals, comes to play quite an important role for Gramsci in terms of thinking about culture and intellectual work. This is the idea of the arditi, which is a military term. Gramsci uses a lot of them. For anyone familiar with his lexicon, the war of maneuver, the war of position, etc., metaphors of kind of ditches and earthworks, or, in the idea of hegemony. But Gramsci, following the First World War, thinks about a particular type of character in early 20th century warfare that has become prominent, the idea of the commando, the ardito, who play a kind of quite important cultural role in terms of the sort of their relationship to, in military terms, to the rest of the army. So particularly the Italian army, which in many respects in the First World War was a quite sort of demobilized and kind of pacified force, but had this kind of small group of kind of very active, daring ones, as the term literally means, of kind of elites within them, sort of celebrated fighting force. And Gramsci takes this idea and says that it actually kind of helps to characterize something about modern Italy in general, that modern Italy has kind of been characterized by a sort of volunteer action, similar to that carried out by these kind of elite troops in the military sphere. Now, so this, I mean, is both in the political sphere, but also in the cultural one. So he talks about the playwright Luigi Pirandello. Gramsci has a very kind of early, precocious kind of enthusiasm and kind of critic for kind of theatre criticism of prior to him becoming a well-known figure. And Gramsci talks about him as being an ardito culturale, or a sort of cultural ardito, a cultural commando, saying, interestingly, that Pirandello's plays are like grenades that explode inside the brains of the spectators, demolishing their banalities and causing their feelings and thoughts to crumble. And I suppose one of the things that I'm kind of investigating in my work, and I'll maybe finish here, is the extent to which this kind of is a very resonant theme with the idea of the unsettling, the intellectual in its role of disrupting or unsettling the world. Because I think there is a certain kind of arditismo that can be detected in that aspect of the Saidian intellectual, which I suppose my argument is kind of plays part of this traveling backwards and forth between Gramsci and Said. So in order that we have plenty of time for discussions, I'll stop there. And then once again, thank everyone for coming. And okay, I'm going to go and replace Marieke. Yeah.
To just like if maybe the two of you can sort of talk together about what I suppose the resonances between your work, right? Just a bit more about that, since
Yes, no, it's on. I guess we're both looking at a certain political dimension of French literature. Your work being much more contemporary, I noticed this sort of reflection on class being there much more. Whereas I think with texts I look at sort of political natures to do with cultural difference and tackling cultural difference. So I guess if I had to phrase a question for you, it would be sort of, how do you see that relationship between cultural difference, class difference? Are there any intersections you come across in your own work?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you asked this. And I. Okay, so very much so. I mean, it's in a way I picked this one point out because it is the question that is always thrown in Louis' face, for example, and this is what he's reduced to. But it's actually exactly as you say. I mean, he speaks very much to to questions. I mean, he speaks to questions of racialization. He speaks to the question of gender oppression, discrimination based on sexual orientation. So there's a host of I suppose modes of subjectivity that he speaks to, and that also complicates very much I mean, if that can be measured or quantified anyway, but the nature of his audience and how people respond to him. So I picked that one aspect out because it's also a helpful way of bringing him into correspondence with Sartre. And then if I could maybe just come back with a question, if that's okay. Because I suppose there's another point of contact between what we do, which is maybe the relationship between the text and also the reception, and that was what I was wanted to ask you about, how those texts then traveled in France.
Yeah.
So the complexity that you highlighted within them, is that something that was maintained in the critical reception, or in how people responded to them?
I think it varies a lot. So to just take one example, I mentioned Judith Gautier's novel, Iskandar, which what I find very interesting about it is, on the surface, it might seem apolitical because we're dealing, with this sort of medieval chivalric world, which seems very distant, and elements of fairy tale. But then she's writing it at the time, the ideology of a French mission civilisatrice. And so the very time where the discourse is about exporting French culture, colonizing in order to bring French culture, she writes a novel where the protagonist goes from identifying as Western to identifying as Iranian. And so his journey abroad is one of assimilation with the Oriental culture, not one of imposition of his culture. And then you read, if you look at the reviews of the time, how it was received, it ranges from some writer saying, "Oh, this isn't Plutarch. This Alexander is very suspicious, and children should not read this. It will give them confusing ideas." But then I found this really glowing review from Théodore de Banville, who I always saw as a quite conservative figure. He was very critical of Rimbaud, for example. And Banville loves it and writes this, rave review about what a brilliant text it is. So again, I think there's complexity even within the reception. You can have such different responses to what these authors are doing with Iranian sources.
So this is mostly a question for Marieke. I'm wondering if, like, in your work, if you kind of leave literature to look at film at all, because it seems that one of the ways that the French post-war intellectualism really blossomed was specifically in film, right? Like, I'm thinking of Godard, but I'm actually thinking, based on your last comment, the thing that popped into my mind was Jeanne Dielman, right? Which I know is Belgian, right? But it is the epitome of repetition, right? You sit there and you watch this movie where she goes through the same thing over, and it's like, which is part of the reason it tortures the audience. It's meant to, but it deals with all the things Edouard Louis deals with: class, sexuality, violence, gender, repetition. And I guess it's not a question, but I'm sort of wondering if you deal with those, film as a confrontational, intellectual medium at all, even though I know you do literature, but.
Yes, I do. And I think it's interesting because it's maybe specific to the French framework that Louis and others are still so much looking at for the theatre. So most of his texts have now been staged by fairly prominent directors such as Thomas Ostermeyer, and he tours the world with his stage productions. And I find this quite curious that there's such a focus on the theatre, while his influences are very much rooted in the cinema. So Terence Malick is one of them. So I think you're very, very right about I think more about the repetition in Jean Dillman, because I think there's something to that, and there's probably a Beauvoirian a link that actually unites the two, because Beauvoir is another inspiration to Louis that also, I think, influences his concept of repetition, which I think is also something we find in Jean Dillman. So thank you. I will do it more.
Thank you so much. This was really thought-provoking, and I'm really, really happy I made it today here. I have a lot of notes, but while collecting my thoughts and thinking about what you guys were saying, I was thinking maybe there is perhaps one theme that runs across both presentations, and I would be very curious to see what you probably have to say about it. And overall, it's the question of the author and authorship, and more specifically, the idea of the intention of the author versus the use made of a text. And in that sense, I think there is part of Said's work where he is not interested in the intention of the author per se, but much more interested in how certain texts are reorganized, reordered, to make, in this case, an apparatus of power and imperialism in particular make sense. And I think this crosses both your presentations, and this is why I have two questions related to this idea. The first one is, if we think that the intention of the author is almost insignificant in relationship to the uses the political apparatus made of this text, which I think is what Said is implying, because actually every time he betrays himself by almost saying that he loves Flaubert. This is how Flaubert was used. That's a different question. Could we say that Gautier, for example, is an Orientalist? I wouldn't say an Orientalist author, this is too big, but is that text an Orientalist text? And I could even go perhaps the sentence itself of the question of identifying with the other, as generally felt perhaps by Gautier. I don't have any good reason to doubt that, but it could be used very quickly to as an instrument to deepen even more the idea of othering by emphasizing the surprise. There's an element of surprise that these people I could identify with. The moment I could identify with, there is a hidden premise that is before that. That means I thought that I could not identify. And that first hidden subtext could help you very much emphasize the Orientalist nature of the person you're identifying with. Now, I'm not saying this is what she meant in this country, but probably this is what the text would mean in the context of an imperialist use to it. And this is where Said would come in. So I would be very curious, honestly, to see if you would think that is this an Orientalist sentence, not to go to say an author or a text, is this an Orientalist sentence following this definition or not? Or is it just what you're beautifully suggesting? Perhaps it's just a different kind of Orientalism, but it's still another Orientalism. And my question to Marieke, I have a very Belgian name, pronunciation for your name.
It's a Belgian name, but
Yeah, we have a Belgian connection.
Because I remember the song of the Marieke. Marieke. So you said Marieke.
yes.
All right. And my question is to you is also related to this question of the author and authorship, and mainly to perhaps the divide that you didn't mention like basically the Foucault-Sartre kind of divide, as Foucault being the intellectual father and spiritual father of Said. And here building like sort of two genealogies that are also very interesting, that Eddie Bellegueule and Jean-Paul Sartre. And the idea here is, could the author produce an emancipatory text? Which to a certain degree, perhaps this is what was one of the main divides maybe between Sartre and Foucault. Foucault at a certain time, he even uses the word left intact, as if someone could produce a text and the text would be left intact while it reaches the other shore of the cover, what is there in the world. Obviously, Foucault didn't believe in that at all. Well, Sartre did believe in this. And I was just curious to see if you could talk more about this particular divide between Sartre and Foucault and their descendants, because basically there is an Eddie Bellegueule Sartre lineage and there is a Said Foucault lineage on the other side. And there's one of the major sides where the division is clear is the question of the authorship and their role. And could you actually hope to produce an emancipatory text, or go the Foucauldian way and think maybe showing how a text is used is much more than enough, rather than producing a new text that could be emancipatory, showing where the text was used for non-emancipatory purposes is perhaps better for the overall project than producing an active, positive emancipatory text. So I wanted, these were the main two questions, but I have much more things to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a very layered question, which picked up on a lot of aspects of Orientalism that I've been thinking about in developing this book. I do think intention matters. And I agree, I think when you read Orientalism, there's this sort of assumption that it doesn't matter who the author is or what they thought, what they're writing is always going to be part of promoting an imperialist logic. And I actually think that's unfair to many authors who are pushing against these dominant discourses. In terms of the surprise betraying a sort of anticipating difference, yes, definitely. I think that's the reality for these authors, which is they expect, a culture that's Islamic, that's geographically distant, to feel foreign, to feel strange, especially because this is only the beginning of French people being able to read Persian literature, to learn more about Persian literature. And so there's this surprise of, oh, now I'm reading it, or now I'm seeing it. Actually, this is not as strange or as foreign as I expected. And I wouldn't necessarily call that Orientalist in the sense of, I'm saying this in order to other Iran. It's more an acknowledgement of a cultural reality, of an existing bias that these authors then push against. Identification, I found very interesting, because the way I found myself articulating is there's a tipping point where it becomes something less nice, let's say. So the initial urge I find quite beautiful. There's, for many authors, they start out sort of acknowledging, oh, I thought this culture would be foreign, distant, and I'm pleasantly surprised. I see I can get to grips with it, I can understand it. In some cases, there are great moments of cultural comparison where Iran is praised over France, which goes so against those hierarchies that Said describes, so they say, oh, there's much more greater social equality in Iran than in France. Or they'll sort of describe the royal architecture being less egocentric than Versailles. And so I find that sort of quite positive, as sort of this process of familiarization, of admiration. Where identification becomes problematic is when it sort of becomes a way of appropriating Iran's cultural heritage. So Julia Hartley, who writes a historical novel about the ancient Persians and says, oh, now I can identify with these figures. Well, Julia Hartley is part of an archaeological mission that appropriates Iranian artifacts, and they're all now in the Louvre. So there's a sort of very literal taking Iranian things, making them French. And so you tell these stories to justify how, oh, this is part of our French heritage, therefore it is now ours. And it can be sort of a way of sort of projecting things that have nothing to do with Iran. So Jules Michelet is really into Zoroastrianism, really into ancient Iran. But then you read on and you start saying, oh, this is the values of the French Revolution. And you think, this doesn't really have much to do with French Revolution. You're just sort of projecting what you want to see on it. And that's why you can relate to it. So sort of those are examples of dynamics where that identification is a lot more, problematic.
I just thought that something more close to my field, which is history of Islamic art, is that one of the early studies of Islamic art, so constructing basically the field of expertise, happened mainly in Iran. And one of the major ideas why it was because obviously the Persian culture and the Indo-European origins of it helped very much identify the Persians are the closest of those who are other. And the main victim was the Arab and the Turk.
Absolutely,
create them as they can. So there was that too. Which is,
no, that comes up many times in the text I look at, absolutely. So in order to elevate the Persians, you denigrate the Arabs and the Turks. And so then the way I see it is sort of another form of that Orientalist binary that Said describes between West and Orient. It becomes between Iran as good Orient and Turks and Arabs as bad Orient.
Just quickly in response to the second, thank you for that. I mean, it is, in a way, it's the crucial problem, isn't it? So is there any link between what they say they want to do, what they do, and how that actually works? Can this ever be even conceived as being successful? And I suppose there are different ways of approaching that question. As far as Sartre is concerned, I think I would like to maintain there is a Foucauldian strain to Sartre sometimes, especially in the later theory. So at the beginning, just after the war, there's this optimism about what writers can do and we all have to be committed to something. And then it starts to crumble in his writings on the theatre when he realizes that the audience, he talks about the playwright losing the play to the audience. And he's a bit frustrated, and to the critics, because, it would be nice to control it and what happens to the play. And then later on, I think he theorizes that in a text called Critique of Dialectical Reason in the early 60s, where he uses the concept of counterfinality to theorize how any act, the act of writing, the act of, tying your shoelaces, is absorbed by the world and can have an effect that you never intended. And so that becomes the focus of theory, in a way, exactly this problem. What happens to a human act once it leaves the human, so to speak, or the individual. So I think that he starts being concerned with that. And there are passages that are much more structuralist in their approach to literary history than the earlier theory. And I mean, personally, I would also reject any oversimplistic attempt to read a text and then rely on the author's supposed intention. I think I agree with you that there's not necessarily a link between them, but I suppose everything that Louise says about authorship, I think, is indicative that the problem is in a way back on the table now, and that people ask questions about authorship, and that the responses are more complex maybe now than they were in the Sartre of the immediate post-war period. But there is, I think, a continuum between, or Louis conceives of his own intervention in the world as a continuum that includes the literature, that includes his intervention in talk shows, that includes his Instagram account. And so there is a package. There seems to be an authorial package that's presented to us. Again, is that in a way, it doesn't matter to me whether there's a personal intention behind this, but there is a persona that includes the text. It includes other appearances, which I suppose was the case in the past as well, but is very prominent now. And so in that sense, I treat both, I suppose, as commentators on the problem of authorship without necessarily thinking that what they want to do is straightforwardly possible, if that makes sense.
Actually, it's also very interesting to see that, if I see it well, but the Foucauldian realm ended up being almost trapped within academia, and the Sartrean one became part of a popular culture called around Edouard Philippe. And I think there is some sort of a major gap today when I look at Edouard Philippe saying there's nothing to be showing anymore. People see everything, and I think on an academic level, this is the other part of the other side of the spectrum almost, is like, no, there is actually a lot to show, and I think the genealogies are interesting, that in a very rough way, Foucault ended up being trapped in academia, and Sartre's descendants are on Instagram.
Thank you. My name is Julia. I'm an artistic director of New York Persian Parade.
Oh, wonderful. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And my question is, since I'm dealing with a little bit more contemporary version of Persian arts, I would like to point out that I did not read your book, but I looked through the table of content, and it seems like in the last chapter, you're dealing with performing arts. And what it looks like, 19th century France was exploring Iranian culture, Persian culture, but it was not exploring the current culture. It was exploring the ancient culture, while Persia is actually having a history of performing arts in a pretty advanced stage. So I'm wondering if you talk about this in the book at all.
Yes. So what I found was the chapter on performing arts, the world of performing arts, ended up being the one closest to what Said describes in Orientalism. It really is, my theory is, because of sort of a visual nature, they're looking for spectacle, exoticism, grandeur, but also because of the financial considerations of putting on a big opera production, say. It's much more populist in that sense of let's, bring in the public, let's charm, let's entertain. And what that means is that these tend to be the least sophisticated engagements with Iranian culture. So they go for historical settings because just, the grandeur of the Achaemenid Empire or the Timurids, it's a way to have sort of grand settings, pomp, drama, stories of epic warfare. But there's no engagement with Iranian performing arts, be that music or theatre. Where you have reflection on contemporary Iran is really in travel writing. And so I do discuss in one section of my chapter on travel writing, French travelers' reactions to Tazier, and then you have a whole range of reactions. Some of them say, oh, wow, this is brilliant, this is so gripping. And some are like really snarky, like, oh God, this is so provincial and cringe. So yeah, very conflicting reactions to local productions of Tazier. So that's really the only case in which contemporary sort of Iranian performance comes up.
Thank you very much. It is an interesting subject.
Mm.